You're listening to the Neurocareers podcast with Dr. K, episode number 11. Dear listeners, we continue our exploration of the careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. And today we're up for an amazing adventure. We will be learning about the mind of a bee. We will talk with an expert on bee sensory and behavioral ecology, Professor Lars Chittka. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. It's a great honor to have you on our podcast. Can you tell us where you are at the moment? Our podcast is international and people are joining us from all over the world. Also, can you please introduce yourself? Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. So, yes, my name is Lars Chittka, and I'm a professor at Queen Mary University of London. And so I'm joining you today from London.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the history behind the research that you are doing? As far as I know, you established the Research Center for Psychology at Queen's Mary University of London. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. I am a biologist by training, actually, but I've always had a fascination with psychology. So even as a school kid, I read this popular scientific journal, Psychology Today. And after 20 years of working as a biologist with interests in perception and learning, albeit with an insect model, the bee, I finally got presumptuous enough to decide I should start a psychology department. And so I did. So at my university, we previously had not had a psychology program. And so fortunately, my university at the time, about 15 years ago, was open to this crazy idea of one man starting a psychology school. And they supported it with plenty of new faculty that we then subsequently hired. And I've very much enjoyed setting up this department and interacting with psychologists working on a diversity of organisms from primates to corvid birds and, of course, humans.
And you chose to work with bees. Why did you choose this particular area of research? What interested you in this topic?
Well, bees, I think, are a rather wonderful model for how much intelligence you can squeeze into how small a nervous system. And they're also a wonderful model for the strangeness of perceptual worlds that some animals construct for their environments. So I started out using color vision of bees as a model system to understand how sensory systems are tuned to the environment. And the sensory systems of bees are profoundly different from our own. So they can see ultraviolet light, which we cannot. They can see polarized light, which is basically, if you remember from your physics lessons, light has wave properties, so it swings in a particular direction. And we can't see that, but bees can, and use this information about polarized light as a compass cube to know whether they're steering north or south or southeast. So the perceptual world is governed by these different senses. So in addition to having a very different visual system, bees also have a magnetic compass. They have a sensitivity to electrostatic fields. So there are all kinds of differences at the sensory level. And that, of course, means that the world inside their minds is also very different. And I found that fascinating already as an undergraduate student. So that's why I chose to delve into that area for my research topic.
All those differences that you researched in bees, Are any of those were adopted by humans? I know that engineers often use certain things that they learn from animals. Maybe you can tell us about some of those adaptations that people acquired.
So I think that is something that people hope to acquire to mimic the computational capacities of an insect brain somehow in silico, and in that way derive insights about how you can compute information efficiently with very little energy demands. So this might come useful for steering unmanned aerial vehicles, which currently run out of batteries fairly swiftly. And of course, an insect brain, or a bee brain specifically, runs on a tiny drop of nectar. And with that can deliver computational capacities such as counting, the recognition of images of human faces, even simple forms of tool use and learning by observation. So there is a lot of storage capacity, but also computational power in an insect brain that I guess engineers are very interested in somehow finding out how insects do these things with so low energy demands.
Maybe you can provide the most fascinating findings that you discovered while studying bees. Maybe some very unexpected things that you even didn't think about when you were just starting your research.
Sure. So I think to give you a bit of background, when I started 30 years ago to research bees, it was already known that they must be good learners because they have a home to which they need to return and which they need to remember. So they can't survive on their own. They can live only in their social context. So they have to have a very precise spatial memory. They have to, when they fly out from the hive to find flower sources, they fly up to 10 kilometers away and return, and need to do that reliably with 100% certainty because it's important to their survival. In addition, they have to learn the features of flowers. So they have to be good shoppers in what I call the flower supermarket. They have to compare different flower species that might be available in their environment, nectar and pollen offerings, and set them in relation to the effort that needs to be invested to get these resources. And then to learn those flowers which are the best, associate their signals, colors, scents, color patterns with a reward, and then forage from predominantly those flowers and disregard others. We had already known that their natural lifestyle demands these learning abilities, but what we hadn't known, and which was quite surprising, is that during my PhD, we discovered that bees can count, that they can, while they're flying from their hives to a food source, we presented them with a series of identical landmarks. They were actually tetrahedral tents shaped like a pyramid. So they were identical, and so bees could only find the correct distance by counting off the correct number of landmarks. And so what we did after we trained the bees to fly along 3 landmarks and then land was to produce a contradiction between the correct number of landmarks, 3, and the learned distance, so that over the same distance which they had previously learned, they would now find more landmarks. So we put 4 or 5 on the same distance, or fewer. And if there were more landmarks encountered on the way from the hive to the training distance, the bees would land at an earlier distance. If they counted off the number of landmarks, and when they counted 3, they would land earlier. And if we reduced the number of landmarks along the route, they would overshoot the target and tend to land at a larger distance. So there was a form of counting ability that we had certainly not expected. So that was a first discovery that hinted in the direction that there's a little more than associative learning of associating, let's say, flower colors with rewards, but that there was a cognitive capacity that so far no one had even considered in an insect. And later, over time, another discovery that really surprised us and everyone else was the finding that bees can recognize images of human faces. So again, we capitalized on the bee's natural ability to associate visual patterns with rewards. So we always give a bee a little drop of sugar water if she's found something in the right way. So in this case, the bees had to land on a little platform in front of a photograph of a human face. And on that platform was a little sugar droplet. And then in a test, very much like a test when you ask crime witnesses if they can recognize the suspect out of a group of other people, in a test, we gave the bees a range of different faces and no rewards. So no further cues as to which one was previously the rewarded one. And of course, they're also shuffled in space, so they can't just fly to the same position. And indeed, with about 80% certainty, the bees picked out the correct face. So that surprised us. But in more recent years, there has been a flurry of discoveries from our team and others around the world that hint at a lot more cognitive complexity than anyone had, I think, anticipated 10 or 15 years ago. So we found, for example, that bees can manipulate objects in a manner that's equivalent to simple tool use. So, for example, we set the bees a so-called string pulling task, and that's a task that historically was used for primates and corvid birds, so classical models of large-brained animal intelligence. And the idea is that you have to get access to a reward that is presented under or behind glass, for example, but you can only get access to it by pulling on a string. And in this case, we had a little artificial flower that was presented under a plexiglass screen with a string that protruded out of the edge of the plexiglass screen. And the bees indeed learned to pull on the string to get access to reward. And not only that, by observing each other, they could learn such a task from each other. So you could see this technique spreading through an entire colony like a social media meme. So we could exactly track the individuals that copied and that passed on the technique to others until basically all the individuals, all the workers in the colony had learned the technique. And such learning by observation in other animals is considered a hallmark of relatively high levels of intelligence. We then did an experiment where the bees had to roll a little ball to a goal area over a horizontal surface, and they could do that just fine. But in this case, we observed that, again, bees could learn this technique from each other, including the correct destination of that ball, but they could even spontaneously improve on what they had seen an experienced bee do. And the trick we played there was that there were 3 balls at different distance from the goal. And of course, the best way to solve the task is to move the closest ball to the target area. But what we did was that we trained the demonstrator, that's how we call an experienced bee that shows a technique to another bee. We trained that demonstrator to learn that she could only, I'm saying she because it's invariably the female workers that we're testing. She could only move the furthest ball because the other 2 were glued down. So that demonstrator bee, of the 3 balls that were available, always moved the furthest ball. And this was also what a naive observer bee was shown. So that observer bee always viewed the experienced bee to move the furthest ball to the target area. And then we put the observer on the spot without the demonstrator and asked, how would you solve the task? And what we found was that spontaneously this observer picked the closest ball, which in this test now was not glued down. So they did not simply ape the demonstrator. They did not simply copy what they had seen. but instead picked the closest goal, which to us indicates that there is a kind of understanding of the desired outcome of the task, a kind of mental exploration of what do I need to do to solve the task in the most efficient manner. So all of these discoveries, even in my lab, and including myself, no one would have thought this possible before we did these experiments. So we have often had this experience that we sort of quietly chuckled, this is never going to work, before trying it, and it did work. So yes, many surprises along the way.
This is what our podcast is about. When people don't anticipate that something will work, but they do it anyway, and the results are really surprising. I'm very curious how this, from the first glance, a very simple nervous system can provide so many abilities to the bees. Can you very briefly describe what is this nervous system about? How is it comprised? And how would you explain all those complex behaviors that you observed in bees?
Yeah, so bee brains are indeed very small. That's probably obvious from just looking at their heads. Their brains are about a cubic millimeter, not larger than a pinhead. So they're tiny, but there's a lot more in there in terms of computational power than in a section of the human brain of the similar volume. So you have to first of all imagine that everything is very elegantly miniaturized. So the components, the nerve cells, are much, much smaller in an insect brain than they are in a human brain. And that's not necessarily a trivial observation. Or let me zoom out a little bit. What you find, the first and best predictor of brain size across animals is their body size. So the larger the animal, the bigger the brain. And there are animals with larger brains than human ones. So if you think about blue whales or elephants, their brains are larger, but their bodies are also larger. But their brains are larger, but not necessarily deliver more intelligence in elephants or blue whales than in the human brain. So the larger the animal, the bigger its brain. That, of course, is different to computing equipment. If you think about it, then let's say the computer for steering a jumbo jet does not necessarily have to be a lot bigger than a small plane because they're basically delivering the same task. And the difference with biological brains is that because conductance speed of neural signals is limited by the size of axons and the size of nerve cells, is that you have to scale them up with body size, because otherwise you'd have very slow delivery of signals across the brain or from the brain to the periphery. So in larger animals, not just the brain overall is scaled up, but also its individual components. So you just have much, much smaller nerve cells in bees' brains. The number of cells compared to a human brain is again very small. So it's under 1 million nerve cells in a bee's brain, whereas in a human brain, we might have about 85 billion. So that's many, many orders of magnitude. But nonetheless, the complexity of the nerve cells that you find in an insect brain is staggering. If you look at the branching patterns of a single neuron in a bee's brain, it might have all the complexity of a fully grown oak tree. So they're extremely widely branched, sometimes with ramifications from one cell body to more or less the entire brain. Each cell might make up to 10,000 contacts with other cells via synapses. And if you consider that each one of these synapses is at least potentially plastic and subject to learning via experiences, then you have a very, very intricate and complex network. I guess that is a reason why, number one, a good reason for studying insect brains when one has the dream of understanding brain function comprehensively is that they're at least relatively small. There are fewer components. The network is smaller by far than a human brain. So we're perhaps closer to the aspiration of ever understanding any brain comprehensively when studying insects than we are with humans. But we're still a long, long way away from that dream. And that is because the wiring diagram of an insect, including a bee, is still far too complex to understand in any kind of comprehensive manner. So we're closer to that dream in insects, I think, than we are in humans, but there's still a long way to go.
How do you study bees? Do you do studies in laboratory settings? Do you also go to the field, or you're combining these two? What are the main techniques that you are doing to study bees, their behavior, and their nervous system?
So we do a little bit of everything. We study bees' navigation under free flight conditions in the wild, so to speak, using a technique called harmonic radar, where we can track bees' spatial whereabouts from their maiden flight, the first time they ever leave the nest or the hive, to their death a few weeks later. So they only live for a few weeks, typically. And this radar technology allows us to track their precise spatial whereabouts while they're flying out and in beginning their lives exploring their environment and later exploiting food sources. And sometimes when a food source withers away, to re-explore and then find a new food source to exploit. Much of our work is also in the laboratory, where we study bees' learning behavior under very controlled conditions. Because obviously, to know what is learned and what is innate, we need to track bees' individual stories from the start of their lives to the beginning of any kind of experiment. And for that, it's useful to keep them under laboratory conditions where we can watch what they're doing, also what they're not doing, what experiences they haven't acquired before any experiments. In terms of the exploration of their nervous system, we do not do that in my laboratory, but through collaborations with other laboratories. What we have done in the past is modeling bee nervous systems or parts of them using empirical knowledge from colleagues who work on the neuroscientific side of things, as well as our psychological work and our behavioral work, to see how one might replicate or underpin these behavioral complexities that I described earlier by simple neural circuits.
Because of the nature of your work, working with bees in different settings, how do you deal with the bee stings? Is this a frequent occasion, or you try to avoid it in any possible way? I think it's not an easy research to do with the insect that also can sting.
Yeah, so most of the time our bees are very peaceful. They don't tend to be aggressive unless they are disturbed at their hives or in the nest. And that, of course, raises alarm bells in their nest if they feel that they're under threat and that there is a large animal. We are, of course, an animal threatening their brood or their honey storages, then they might become a little bit aggressive. Usually during our experiments, the risk is relatively small because these experiments do not take place inside or around the nests, but accidents happen and bees do occasionally sting us. It's something that is actually best avoided, not just because it's painful, but also because over time it is possible to develop allergies to bee stings, and you only develop allergies if you are repeatedly exposed to an antigen. So while, of course, it's possible to grit one's teeth and ignore any stings, there's always that risk of developing an allergy, especially with bumblebees. With honeybees, the risk is relatively smaller, but with bumblebees, a relatively high percentage of people who are repeatedly exposed to the venom might develop an allergy. So it's best to avoid being stung for that reason.
What are the main challenges in your research, apart from bee stings?
The main challenges, there are, of course, intellectual challenges. And one of the things that we have become interested in recent years is the question of whether bees have a mind. I've actually just published a whole book about the mind of a bee in Princeton University Press. And the question there is, do they actually have a form of consciousness? Do they have something that could be called a mind? Is there a form of thinking going on in their little brains? Are they sentient? Do they have emotions? And so on. And we have collected at least several lines of evidence that point in the direction that the answer to these questions is yes, but these are difficult questions. They're difficult in any animal or in a machine. It's very difficult to find a criterion when you would, for example, recognize an artificial intelligence system as conscious or sentient. What's the threshold? When does a system cross that threshold? And so on. So that's a challenge, and it's a tough one, but we're scientists, we like tough challenges. Other than that, I think our behavioral work, I have to admit that I like it because it's relatively easy. It doesn't come with the same experimental challenges, I guess, that my colleagues in molecular biology face, where they sometimes experiment for years pipetting things into dishes and then finding that one of 7 long-winded steps has not worked, and then they need to retrace their steps and start over. Usually in my work, the feedback loops of seeing if something works or doesn't work are relatively short, and you can fix an experimental protocol quite quickly. And there's a playful element in devising the kinds of experiments that we do, which I think makes it enjoyable to do these kinds of experiments. Other than that, funding is always a challenge these days. We are faced with an environment where the kind of curiosity-motivated research that we do is often more difficult to justify than strictly applied research or research that has the promise of being directly converted into health benefits or benefits in robotics or engineering. And I understand that. I understand that such research often takes priority, but we've somehow found a way around these obstacles and so far always secured some sort of funding for our research.
I hope you will secure it for many years ahead, because I think it's fascinating research and really adds a lot of knowledge that people can use. It helps, like you said, to learn about the complexity of the nervous system in general and understand nervous system better when we are studying the nervous system and behavior of the bees. I have a question about the students or young researchers that come to your lab to do studies. What are their backgrounds? How they're making decisions to start doing this particular type of research? I think this will be helpful for other students who will hear us who might want to join this field of studies.
That's a very good question. So people come to my lab from all over the world, which is wonderful to see. So we've got students from a variety of countries and indeed a variety of continents. And to join this kind of work, I think, involves almost conscious decision not to go for fashionable work in the molecular sciences, in neuroscience, and so on, you have to be aware that the vast majority of my colleagues work on standard model systems such as Drosophila fruit flies or rodents or zebrafish. And this work, behavioral, psychological work on bees, is very much niche work. And you have to make a conscious decision to not follow the mainstream and decide, okay, I'm going to just be motivated by what I'm myself curious about and join these sorts of efforts. And that's wonderful to see, to have students who are just curious about studying something that doesn't necessarily look perhaps like at least by default, a wonderful career prospect, at least not if you're following the sort of mainstream topics in science. Nonetheless, all our young people find employment in research if they strive to do so. So we've been very successful in producing new researchers that have moved on to prestigious positions all over the world in very good academic institutions. So it seems to be working quite well.
In the recent years, we hear more and more about problems with bees. Bees are under threat in many regions of our world. And I noticed some information on your laboratory website that motivates people to help bees to grow flowers. Can you tell a little bit more about this problem in general? What are the main causes and how we as people can support bees and help them live?
Very good question. I need to differentiate a little bit. There is a public perception, often propagated by slightly misguided media information, that the honeybee is under threat. And the honeybee is only one of about 20 or 30,000 bee species that populate our planet. A honeybee is a domesticated animal. It can be viewed very much like domestic chickens or cattle and so on. And it's not under threat, not anywhere. So indeed, the number of honeybee hives that are kept are increasing globally. And that is actually more of a problem than many people are aware of, because the honeybees, these domestic animals, as they are, in fact, compete with many native bees that are not kept by beekeepers and not supported by a lobby. So it's the many other species of bees out there, of which many are under threat. And these bees are under threat for a number of reasons. One is the very widespread use of pesticides in industrial agriculture. People spray things that are designed to kill insects on their plants, and also the seeds are dunked in pesticides that are subsequently found in the leaves of these plants and also in the floral nectar. The idea there is to keep herbivores away, but there is no way to make something poisonous for a herbivore and not for a bee. And of course, the bees collect the nectar with these pesticides, bring it back to the hive, feed their young with it, and the same applies to wild bees that are often solitary, that have to provide for their young, and they basically feed their young with poisoned food, and of course poison themselves through these pesticides. In addition, there are often, again, in our largely industrialized agriculture, very few useful floral resources. So to the extent that you have horizon to horizon cornfields, that's a desert for a bee. There's no food to find. So this shortage of food sources and also nesting opportunities for wild bees is another big problem. And that's where we can help. So the help can be provided not by putting in more domesticated honeybee colonies, but by providing flower resources. And so if you Google a bit of information, it depends on where on the planet you are, but if you sow native flower seeds and plant plenty of plants with flowers around the year, you have not only an enjoyable garden, but you can also observe plenty of interactions of the flowers that you've planted with native bees, hopefully, that will thrive if they're given these additional feeding opportunities. And perhaps counterintuitively, in urban environments, there's an extra opportunity for wild bees because many people, even if they don't have a garden, you might have a flower box on a balcony. In these urban environments, there are actually fewer pesticides than there are often in agricultural landscapes. So bees might be freer to thrive if they just can find the right kinds of flowers. So it's important to consider which flowers. Many gardening flowers are bred for being showy for human observers, but they're perfectly useless for bee visitors in terms of their nectar and pollen provisions. So do a bit of Google searching for native flowers that you could plant in your garden or just on a little flower box on a balcony, perhaps.
I'm sure our listeners will keep that in mind. Can you tell us a little bit about your future plans? Where do you go from all the research that you have conducted so far? What are your next steps?
So one thing that I'm increasingly interested in is the question of whether bees are sentient, whether they are capable of enjoyment, but also suffering, and the possibility that they might sense pain. And in my book, I already describe a few lines of evidence that point in that direction. We have recently done more research that at least seems suggestive of the possibility that bees might be capable of a pain-like sensation. And if this is further substantiated, then this, of course, raises some important ethical considerations about how insects are treated in research laboratories, where their treatment is entirely unregulated. So people can do all kinds of very invasive treatments on tethered insects and so on without any anesthesia or analgesic and so on. And that might need some re-evaluation. And I'd like to make further contributions on that front. It's also this line of research, I think, is interested for a now growing industry of raising insects for food, both in human consumption and as feed for conventional livestock. And the idea there is not necessarily a bad one. So the idea to replace conventional livestock food with insects in part comes about because, of course, we have to feed a growing human population while at the same time combating climate change. And that's a huge challenge because raising things like cattle and pigs and so on for human consumption has a huge climate imprint, and also just the area-wise footprint on the planet is tremendous. And you can raise insects much more efficiently in terms of calories per energy and invested in area used and also climate gas emissions. So there is a kind of green thinking behind the expanding insect food industry. But one thing that people also think is a plus is the fact that, so they think there are no ethical considerations as opposed to conventional livestock. And I think while this industry is expanding and finding its feet, I think it's important to consider these questions seriously so that we don't repeat the same mistakes as in chicken battery farming and so on. It might be that in some instances there are fewer ethical concerns for insects, but it should be considered. So we might find out that, for example, unlike chickens, some insect larvae naturally grow in tightly confined spatial positions. Some insect larvae grew en masse on rotting fruit and so on. So they don't mind if they're tightly packed together while they're growing up. But it needs to be looked at, I think, on a case-by-case basis. So that's this kind of work is something that I'd like to make a contribution to in the coming years.
I'm looking forward to getting to know more about this. I think it's a very important field, and the things that we even wouldn't think about, that insects can feel pain. I think this is the concept that not many people at all are even considering. Thank you so much for doing this. And speaking about the future vision, how would you see the field of animal cognition in general 20, 30 years from now? What are the main trends do you foresee in this area?
So I think that we're witnessing at the moment a kind of new Copernican revolution, in a sense that we used to think that the human mind was entirely unique, or indeed that we humans are the only things with minds on the planet. So the old Descartes view of animal machines, that animals are largely living entirely in the present, that they're driven by reflexes or direct hardwired responses to current stimuli, that it's basically dark in the animal mind. And we're increasingly finding not just forms of animal intelligence that are just reduced versions of human intelligence, but we're finding that there are all kinds of forms of intelligence out there in the animal kingdom that are often very different from what is familiar to us, that all the way down from the different sensory filters that I had mentioned at the past, the fact that the perceptual world of animals is already very different, but so is their information processing. So is the way in which they prioritize different kinds of information. Some of the things that are important to us might be entirely meaningless to animals, and vice versa. And so there's a large diversity of seemingly alien minds out there. And I think this study of comparative forms of minds or consciousness is something that we're currently seeing it in its infancy, and that hopefully will grow over the coming decades.
And that's beautiful. And this is a little bit different view on humans, not as a center of the universe or of animal kingdom, but just one of them. We can have so many other type of consciousness, and we're learning about those, and we're a part of that, not necessarily maybe the center of it. That's a very different and important view on our existence in general. If our listeners want to learn more about the research you are doing, maybe you can tell a little bit about the resources where they also can contact you, and maybe you can give several more highlights from your book and tell a little bit more about it, so that also people can read and learn more about this fascinating field.
Thank you. So I think for a general overview of the topics that we have just discussed, my book, The Mind of a Bee, that was just published, is probably the most comprehensive resource that I can recommend. If you are scientists and you're interested into finding out more about the experimental details, statistics, and so on, then of course all this work is also documented in original scientific publications that can be found on my lab's web page, and all the papers are freely downloadable from that web page. It should be relatively easily located if you just Google my name. I think there's only one Lars Chittka. It's a slightly unusual combination of a Scandinavian first name and an Eastern European last name. So if you Google my name, you'll find my lab's web page and all the publications that document in more detail all the claims that I've just touched upon.
Thank you. And we will provide the link to your lab and to your book in our podcast notes so that people can find this information. The last question that I want to ask is about doing impossible, because this is the name of our podcast, Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible. What suggestions do you have for those people who are just starting their careers in sciences, maybe even in animal cognition? What would you suggest them when they are dreaming about something, have some ideas, but think that this might be not possible?
Well, I think the most important idea is to do something that you're passionate about and curious about. So science in general is very hard work. Any scientific career is fraught with uncertainty, at least in the early stages, and with lots of work. And you don't want to do lots of work under conditions where you're not very interested in the questions that you're researching. You don't want to be in a setting where someone tells you what to ask and how to do it, but one where you're in the driver's seat of your project, where you're given the freedom to explore what you're curious about and then put your full energy behind it. So I would advise, rather than the common search for mighty and powerful and influential scholars with fashionable lab searches, think about what you're curious about, what you want to discover, and then find the kind of host lab that facilitates that and gives you the kind of freedom to explore what you really want to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a great advice. I see many students who just want to become medical doctors or get some other, at this time, prestigious careers, and not even thinking about whether this really is what they want to do. So that's why I want this podcast to provide opportunities for people to hear about things and maybe to inspire them to do something that they really want to do, that they are curious about, that they are interested in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this beautiful podcast interview. And I wish you all possible success in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the same to you, of course.
Thank you.